We have a super interview coming up next with the best sports writer in New York City. But first, a super recap of a game that didn't go as my prediction forecasted, sadly. Although it was certainly trending that way, Cincinnati and up-and-coming quarterback Joe Burrow controlled their destiny late in the fourth quarter against the LA Rams on Super Bowl Sunday. The Rams held a narrow lead at half, but the Bengals jumped in front in the third and were minutes away from edging the Rams in the big game, as I said that they would. That's when breakout wide receiver Cooper Kupp decided on a different narrative. He took over for LA on its home turf and led them to victory. A competitive affair, that's what we all wanted to see. The game had 3 lead changes and mostly kept within a 1-possession margin. The Rams led 13-10 at halftime, but the Bengals scored 10 straight points on their first 2 drives in the third quarter to make things very interesting. Trailing 2016 in the fourth, LA scored a touchdown to retake the lead with under 2 minutes remaining. High drama, and then went on to stop Cincinnati on their final drive on downs. Final score, LA 23, Cincy 20. Kupp was named Super Bowl MVP after finishing the game with 8 receptions, 92 yards, and 2 touchdowns, including 3 receptions and the game-winning score on the Rams' final drive. Couple of fun Bronx factoids, too, in the big game. The Lombardi Trophy, of course, is named after Fordham great Vince Lombardi, arguably the greatest NFL head coach of all time. From the 7 blocks of granite as a player at Fordham to NFL greatness as a head coach, the Super Bowl winning team takes home a trophy bearing his name. Coincidentally, as I've mentioned in recent weeks here on the show, the LA Rams franchise is named after the Fordham Rams. Music to our Bronx ears. And speaking of music, if that's not enough, what a halftime show featuring plenty of hip-hop, perhaps an ode to the Bronx too, especially when among the cast of LA stars was the great and ageless Mary J. Blige, born in the Bronx at Fordham Hospital. That's my Super Bowl recap, and here's our super interview from LA with Bob Glauber. Honored to be joined this morning by the former president of the Pro Football Writers of America, Newsday columnist, and 3-time New York State Sports Writer of the Year, Bob Glauber. Bob, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Bob. How you doing?
I'm doing great. 2021, big year for you. We have a new book out. You also won the Bill Nunn Memorial Award from the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I thought a great place for us to start this morning was a conversation wrapped around Brian Flores, someone that you've written about lately for Newsday. Of course, he's attempting to take on the NFL and many teams, in his latest lawsuit alleging that the hiring system in the league is plainly biased against black coaches and coaches of color. I know that you've written some articles on the subject for Newsday. What's your take and what's the latest with Brian Flores?
You know, I think there is probably an inherent bias that sometimes owners and hiring people aren't even aware of. And I think it's a fight that black coaches have fought for a number of years, and going back to literally, and this is related to the book, and it's not trying to pump it up, but I'm just for historical perspective. 1965, Marion Motley is a Hall of Fame running back for the Cleveland Browns. He wants to be an assistant coach with the Browns, and there's no job there. He tried with Otto Graham in Washington, his former quarterback, and couldn't get a job there. There were no black assistant coaches back in 1965, right? So now, fast forward to 2021, 22, 34% of the assistant coaches in the NFL are African American. Yet each year, it's like there are fewer black coaches being hired as head coaches. You had 3 diverse hires this year, but there were 3 diverse firings. So it's, kind of they're back to where they started. It's a complicated discussion. There's no question. It just is. And I think that the league, when you see the commissioner admit we are not where we want to be, we are not where we should be, I think that is an acknowledgement that there is a problem. Now, the league is far different than the owners. And so that you always have to keep that in mind. The owners are the ones who make those decisions. And, in most of the time, they're going with white head coaches. It's like you want to pick the best head coach and you don't want to see color. There's just no question you don't want to see color, but it comes into the equation. And I think it's the last barrier. It's the last hurdle that the NFL has in terms of the color issue, because once quarterbacks now, there are many successful black quarterbacks, it is not an issue. 20 years ago, it was an issue. So now I think, coaching is now the last frontier where that is concerned. Long answer, but it's a complicated situation.
Oh, 100%, Bob. And I mean, I thought, in my opinion, he was the best candidate in the hiring cycle. I was not surprised at all by his 58-page lawsuit, but I just wonder at this time if a victory for him ends up paving the road for others, but at his own cost, very much like Curt Flood in baseball.
Yes, I think Curt Flood is a good analogy to that. And Colin Kaepernick, there's something in there. I do think, though, that Brian Flores will get a job. And I say that because, he's obviously got the resume. I think this lawsuit will be settled. I don't think it's going to go to the bitter end. I don't think it's going to go to a jury. So usually these are settled, and I think that he will have drawn attention to it. And if he gets the right opportunity and it works with, a prospective owner, I think he would get a job.
And as you mentioned, very interesting conversation because, the NFL seems to be acknowledging that there are some issues, of course, but the league is predominantly black.
Yeah, and that's the number. And I had an interesting conversation with Cyrus Merry, who was a civil rights attorney who wrote the Rooney Rule. Johnny Cochran, the former attorney who has passed away, and Dan Rooney got together under the threat of a lawsuit back in 2002, 2003, and came up with the Rooney Rule. And Cyrus's contention is that it's not the 70% African-American player number. That's not it, because the real population that you got to look at is that it's 34% African-American assistant coaches, because that's the pool that you're drawing from with this head coach equation. And there is underrepresentation when you look at a third of the NFL's assistant coaches are black, yet the overwhelming majority of the head coaches are white.
Which, of course, brings us to your latest book and a 75th anniversary of the players that broke the NFL's color barrier. I had mentioned Bill Nunn before because I think it's very interesting. You're kind of doing very much the same thing that he did for the Pittsburgh Steelers as a sports writer that is helping others with basically bringing up this history. Tell us a little bit more about Kenny Washington, Woody Strode, Marion Motley, Bill Willis, and the Forgotten First.
Well, Bob, I always appreciate a chance to talk about this because it really is an important subject. It's been 75 years since the NFL was, we'll call it reintegrated, because there had been black players in the 20s and early 30s. But there was a 12-year period where there were no black players in the NFL, zero, and by design. So these four men were the first to cross the color line in modern pro football in 1946. And Kenny Washington and Woody Strode with the Rams, and Bill Willis and Marion Motley with the Browns. Very interesting Super Bowl matchup here, Bob, because it's the Rams who were the first to integrate in the NFL, and it's the Bengals who are owned by Mike Brown, who was the son of Paul Brown, who integrated the Cleveland Browns with Bill Willis and Marion Motley. They were in the All-America Football Conference at the time, eventually merged with the NFL. So this matchup is pretty symbolic, and it's being played in the city where pro football was integrated permanently in 1946, and not the same stadium. That was at the Coliseum, but it's the same city. So a lot of symbolism to this matchup.
That was part one of our interview with three-time New York State Sports Writer of the Year, Bob Glover. Tune in next time for part two.